The first call that didn't make sense came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. I need to say that clearly, because later, when the television stations were still broadcasting and the analysts were drawing their timelines, they put the start of everything at dawn. They pegged it to the first hospital overflow, the first interstate closure, the first National Guard mobilization. But I was sitting in a chair on the 9th floor of the Consolidated Emergency Communications Center on Vine Street. And I'm telling you, it started at 2:47 in the morning. And it started with a woman named Dolores Moya calling from a bathtub. My name is Aaron Calloway. I was 31. I had been a 911 dispatcher for the city of Columbus, Ohio, for 6 years and 4 months. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because I preferred it. Overnights were cleaner. Fewer MVAs, fewer domestic calls that dragged on for 20 minutes while you kept someone talking until a unit arrived. Overnights were drunks and chest pains and the occasional structure fire. You could get through the shift with a thermos of coffee and a crossword and the quiet hum of a building that was 3/4 empty. That Wednesday, there were 4 of us on the floor. Keith Palmieri had the south grid. Janae Washington had west. Michael Stottlemyre, who everyone called Stotts, had north. I had east. Our supervisor, Rita Alcafor, was in the glass-walled office behind us, doing scheduling. 5 people, 96 phone lines, and a city of 900,000 sleeping. Dolores Moya's call auto-routed to my station because her cell pinged off an East Side tower. I answered with the standard open, 911, what is the location of your emergency? She was whispering. That wasn't unusual. Domestic violence callers whisper. Home invasion callers whisper. But Dolores wasn't whispering out of caution. She was whispering because she was out of breath. I could hear water sloshing. I could hear the shallow, rapid panting of someone whose lungs weren't getting enough air. My husband, she said. He went to sleep at 9, normal. I woke up because he was standing next to the bed. He bit me. He bit my arm. I locked myself in the bathroom. I dispatched a unit. I stayed on the line. I asked the standard questions. Is the door secure? Can you describe the injury? Is there anyone else in the home? She answered each one, and then she said something that I typed into the notes, but did not flag as significant. He didn't say anything. I called his name 11 times. He was looking at me, and he didn't say anything. The unit arrived in 9 minutes. Dolores stopped whispering. The officers entered the house. I heard through Dolores's open line the sound of the front door going in, and then radio traffic on my second channel. The officers calling for backup, voices tight and fast. One of them said, "Suspect is non-responsive to commands. Advancing on contact." Then a taser deployment. Then silence. Then taser ineffective. Suspect still advancing. Then the sound of something heavy, and the call disconnected. I logged it. I filed the incident code. I moved to the next call. That is what I want you to understand about dispatch. You move to the next call. You are not a responder. You are not a doctor. You are the voice between the person who is drowning and the person who can swim. And your job is to hold the rope steady while someone else goes into the water. You are trained, rigorously and repeatedly, to not be in the room, to hear everything and carry nothing, to clear the line. I cleared the line. I took the next call, and the next. And for the following 93 minutes, the board was quiet, and I thought Dolores Moya was a domestic incident with an unusual detail. And I did not think about her again until the board caught fire. By 4:20 a.m., My east grid was pulsing. 7 active calls. That was unusual for a Wednesday overnight, but not unprecedented. A bad MVA on the 270 interchange could generate that many in 10 minutes. But these calls weren't clustered on the highway. They were scattered across 8 zip codes, and they were all the same call. Someone went to sleep. Someone woke up wrong. Someone attacked. I handled them in order. I dispatched units. I logged narratives. The language was different each time. My roommate, my mother, the guy in 4B. But the architecture was identical. Sleep, change, violence, no speech, no response to names. At 4:31, Keith leaned back from his console and pulled off his headset. He looked at me across the floor. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His board was lit up the same way mine was. Janae said without turning around, "I've got 14 pending on West. I can't get units. County's not answering mutual aid." Stotts had his hand pressed flat against his forehead, which is what Stotts did when he was trying to think above the noise. His lips were moving. He was still on an active call, but his eyes were on the master board, the wall-mounted display above Rita's office that showed aggregate call volume for the entire system. That board had been green all night. It was yellow now. In the 6 years I'd worked in that building, I had seen it go yellow twice. Once during the July 2021 derecho, and once during a system test that someone forgot to announce. Rita came out of her office. She stood behind Janae's chair and watched the calls populate on the screen. Small blue dots blooming across the city map like a time-lapse of something growing. She put her hand on Janae's shoulder. Then she walked to the shift phone on the wall and called the watch commander at CPD. She was on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, her face had the particular stillness of a person who has just been told something they cannot yet organize into language. "They're activating all off-duty personnel," she said. "Every unit they have is deployed. Fire is overwhelmed. Hospitals are on diversion." She paused. "They want us to implement mass call protocol." Mass call protocol was designed for tornadoes, for gas leaks affecting entire neighborhoods, for events where individual dispatch was no longer possible and the system switched to triage. Priority 1 calls only. Everyone else gets a recorded message. I had trained on it. I had never executed it. I switched my station to the protocol. The change was immediate and ugly. Instead of ringing through to my headset, calls began stacking in a queue with a recorded greeting. "You have reached 911. Due to high call volume, your call will be answered in the order it was received. If you are experiencing a life-threatening emergency." Every call was a life-threatening emergency, every single one. I could see the queue count on my screen. It had been 7 when I switched. It went to 20 within a minute, 40 within 5. The number kept climbing with a patience that felt like cruelty. 1 digit at a time, each digit a person in a room with something they couldn't explain. Holding a phone, listening to a recording of my voice telling them to wait. At 4:55, I answered a call from a man named Gerald Yost. He was 67. He was a retired pipe fitter. He told me these things calmly and precisely because he wanted me to know he was not confused, not drunk, not senile. He was in his living room. His wife, Carol, had fallen asleep on the couch at 8 o'clock. She had gotten up 20 minutes ago. She had tried to bite their dog. The dog had gotten away. Gerald had not. "She got my hand," he said. "She got my hand pretty good. I've got a towel on it. I'm in the garage. I put the car against the door. I told Gerald help was coming. I did not tell Gerald that I had no units to send. "You don't have anyone, do you?" he said. Not a question. He could hear it in the silence between my sentences, in the millisecond too long it took me to respond. 31 years of reading pipe systems had made Gerald Yost fluent in the language of pressure and flow. And he could hear the pressure in my voice and the absence of flow behind it. "We are experiencing extremely high call volume," I said. "I'm going to stay on the line with you." "I know what that means," Gerald said. "I've been listening to the scanner. I've got my own scanner. I know you're alone over there." I was not alone. There were 4 of us on the floor and Rita in her office. But Gerald was right about the thing he actually meant, which is that there was no one behind us. No second wave, no cavalry warming up. The system I connected people to had been a living network 12 hours ago. And now, it was a switchboard wired to nothing. I stayed on the line with Gerald Yost for 38 minutes. He told me about the dog, a beagle mix named Humphrey, who had arthritis in his back hips. He told me about the towel on his hand, which was a bleach-stained beach towel from a 2019 trip to Hilton Head. At 5:33 a.m., Gerald said, "Aaron, I think I need to go to sleep now." I said, "Gerald, please stay awake." He said, "I don't think that's up to me anymore." The line stayed open for another 4 minutes. I heard his breathing change. I heard the phone drop. I heard something else after that. Movement, a different kind of breathing, wet and mechanical. And I disconnected the call and sat very still in my chair and pressed my palms flat against the desk until they stopped shaking. My cue read 347. Dawn came through the east-facing windows like an accusation. Keith was still at his console. Janae was still at hers. Stotts had gone to the bathroom at 5:15 and had not come back. Rita had gone down the hall to find him 12 minutes later, and she had not come back either. That left 3 of us in a room designed for 40, with a board showing 1,174 calls in queue, and a city map so dense with blue dots it looked like a solid bruise from the river to the outer belt. I should explain the building. The Consolidated Emergency Communications Center sat on the 9th floor of a municipal tower downtown. Access required a key card for the elevator, a second key card for the floor, and a code for the operations room door. The building had its own generator, its own HVAC loop, and a kitchen stocked with enough vending machine food to sustain a full overnight shift. It was not a bunker. It was not designed for siege. But it was high, it was locked, and it was forgotten by everyone outside it, which in the math of that morning made it one of the safest places in Columbus. Janae stood up. She took off her headset and laid it on the desk with a care that seemed almost ceremonial, positioning the microphone parallel to the keyboard's edge. Then she turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Keith said. "My kids are at my mother's in Whitehall," she said. "I've been calling. She's not answering." "Janae, you can't drive through that." "I'm not asking." She looked at me. We had worked the same shift for 2 years. We had eaten vending machine dinners together 4 nights a week and talked about her boys, Deshaun, who was 9, and Marcus, who was 6 and had just learned to ride a bike without training wheels. She looked at me, and I saw the complete, settled architecture of a decision that had been built while she was still answering calls, constructed silently behind every 911, "What is your emergency?" for the past 3 hours. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry," I said. "Be fast." She left. The door closed behind her with the heavy magnetic click of the lock re-engaging. And then there were 2 of us, and the calls kept coming. Keith and I sat in the hum of the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The HVAC pushed air that smelled like recycled carpet. The master board on the wall had passed yellow 90 minutes ago and was now red, the color I'd never seen outside a training slide, And the queue counter had stopped updating at 2000 because that was the display's maximum. And the actual number behind it was something the system was still trying to count. I put my headset back on. I pressed the button that connected me to the next call in queue. A girl answered. She sounded 14, maybe 15. She said her name was Marisol. She said she was in a closet. She said her father and her brother were in the hallway, and they weren't her father and her brother anymore. She said this with a flat, depleted calm that I recognized because I had heard it in my own voice for the past 2 hours. The sound of someone who had already screamed and already cried and had come out the other side into a place where language was just a way to keep the silence from getting too close. I asked Marisol if the closet door had a lock. She said it had a latch, the kind you slide. I asked if there was anything heavy she could push against it. She said there were boxes of Christmas decorations. I told her to stack them. I heard her moving, heard the scrape of cardboard on wood. She was breathing hard, but steady. She was doing it. "Okay," she said. "Okay, they're stacked." "Good. That's good. Are you going to send someone?" I closed my eyes. The queue was a number I couldn't see anymore. The radio channels were either silent or screaming. I had not heard a unit acknowledge a dispatch in over an hour. "I'm going to stay on the line with you," I said. "That's not the same thing," Marisol said. "No," I said. "It's not." By 7 a.m., the calls stopped being about bites. A woman in German Village reported that her entire street was walking. Just walking. Dozens of people moving east along Lansing Street in a loose column, silent, unhurried, their arms at their sides. She said they looked like a parade, with no music and no spectators. She said one of them was wearing a hospital gown. She said one of them was a child in pajamas printed with dinosaurs. A man at a gas station on Broad reported that the infected, he used that word, and it was the first time I'd heard a caller use it, had stopped trying to break through the glass. They were standing outside, 6 of them, facing the building. Not moving, not pounding, just standing at a distance of approximately 10 feet, evenly spaced, like they were waiting for a signal. That detail caught in my throat. I had been treating the calls as a violence problem. People attacking people, the same architecture as every domestic and assault call I'd ever handled, just scaled up. But violence has a logic. It surges, peaks, exhausts itself. What these callers were describing wasn't surging. It was organizing. I relayed what I could to Keith. He was on a call of his own, but he developed the ability to listen to me and his caller simultaneously, a skill you get from years of monitoring a radio channel and a phone line at the same time. He nodded without looking up, and I saw his jaw tighten, and I knew he was hearing similar things on his grid. Marisol was still on my line. I had moved her to a secondary channel so I could work the primary queue while keeping her connected. She could hear me answering other calls. I could hear her breathing. Every few minutes, she would say, "I'm still here," and I would say, "I know." It was the most honest communication I had conducted all night. 2 people telling each other the only thing that was true. At 7:22, the phones went partially dead. Not all of them. Not at once. The queue counter, which had been frozen at its maximum, began to drop. 2,000, 1,430, 900. I watched it fall and felt a relief so immediate and so animal that it disgusted me, because the number wasn't dropping because help had arrived. It was dropping because people had stopped calling. Either they had found safety, or they had stopped being people who could dial a phone. Keith watched the counter fall too. He took off his headset. He set it down. He said, "Aaron." "I see it." "Aaron, That's not a good thing. I know that's not a good thing, Keith. He stood up. He was 44, ex-Army, built like a man who had once been required to carry heavy things and had never fully stopped. He walked to the window. The 9th floor windows didn't open. Sealed glass, tinted against the afternoon sun. But you could see the full eastern spread of the city from up here. On a normal morning, you'd see headlights on the 70, delivery trucks on 4th Street, the slow clockwork of a city winding itself into the day. Keith stood at the window for a long time. "There are cars on the highway," he said. "Not moving, stopped, doors open. Some of them are still running. I can see exhaust." He paused. "There are people on the road between the cars, walking, all going the same direction." "Which direction?" "West." I thought about that. West was downtown. West was us. "Keith," I said, "we should check the stairwells." He turned from the window. The look on his face was one I'd seen before, on the face of a firefighter we'd dispatched to a collapse, who radioed back that the building was still settling. The look of a professional recalculating the space between himself and the problem, and finding it had shrunk. He went to the operations room door and opened it slowly. The hallway beyond was the same hallway it had always been. Gray carpet, fluorescent panels, the faint smell of the cleaning solution the night crew used. But it was empty in a way that hallways in a staffed building are not empty. The other offices on the floor, IT, records, administrative, had been vacant all night, their doors closed, their lights off. The emptiness had been routine at midnight. At 7 in the morning, it was something else. Keith walked to the stairwell door at the end of the hall. He put his ear against it. He stood there for 15 seconds, and I watched from the doorway of the operations room, 30 feet away. And in those 15 seconds, I became aware of a sound I had been hearing for hours without recognizing it. A low, irregular tapping that came from somewhere below us in the building. Rising faintly through the structure itself, transmitted through steel and concrete the way a heartbeat transmits through a stethoscope. Keith came back. He closed the operations room door and engaged the secondary lock. The deadbolt that was there for active shooter protocol, which we tested once a year, and I had always thought of as performative. "Something's in the building," he said. "We did an inventory because that's what you do when the training runs out. You count what you have. It's a way of thinking with your hands while your brain catches up." In the operations room, we had 38 workstations, each with a monitor, a keyboard, and a headset. We had the dispatch software, which was still running on the city's fiber backbone. We had a server room behind a locked door that hummed with a heat that could warm the room if the HVAC failed. We had the master radio panel, which connected to CPD, CFD, EMS, county, and state channels. We had a wall of charging radios, 16 portables in a rack, all green. In the kitchen, we had 2 vending machines, one stocked with snacks and one with drinks. Janae's lunch bag was still in the refrigerator, a detail I noticed and then deliberately stopped noticing. We had a water cooler with a full 5-gallon jug and a spare underneath. We had a first aid kit mounted on the wall that contained bandages, aspirin, and an expired EpiPen. In Rita's office, we had a landline that connected to the city's administrative phone system. We had a window that looked out over the operations floor. We had a coat closet containing Rita's rain jacket, an umbrella, and a pair of walking shoes she kept for her lunch break. That was everything. That was the full material inventory of our survival. Keith and I sat across from each other at adjacent workstations, his and mine, the chairs we'd sat in all night. And we talked. We talked with the deliberate, procedural calm of 2 people who were drawing on the last reserves of their professional selves before the personal selves underneath took over. "Generators on the 3rd floor," Keith said. "If power goes, we'll lose it. No way to reach it without going down 6 flights through whatever's in the stairwell. The dispatch system's still up. For now. The radios are independent. Battery and portable antenna. If the software goes, we still have voice." "Who's listening?" It was a fair question. I had been monitoring the main channels since 5 a.m. CPD dispatch had gone silent at 6:10. CFD had gone silent at 6:40. The county channel carried intermittent traffic units calling for backup that didn't come. Officers reporting positions that no one acknowledged. The state channel had one repeating message. Automated broadcasting shelter locations at Rickenbacker, at the fairgrounds, at 3 high schools on the west side. Whether those shelters were still operational, the recording didn't say. I turned back to my console. The queue was at 194, still falling. I put my headset on and took the next call. A man named Arthur, elderly by his voice. He was in a second-floor apartment on Champion Avenue. His downstairs neighbor had been beating on his door since 5 in the morning. The door was holding. Arthur had filled his bathtub with water because he'd once lived through a hurricane in Galveston, and that's what you did. He had a transistor radio, and he was listening to the same automated shelter broadcast I was monitoring. "Is Rickenbacker real?" he asked. "Is there actually someone there?" "The broadcast is coming from a state emergency channel," I said. "It's an official source." "That's not what I asked." Arthur was right. It wasn't what he'd asked. He'd asked if there was a living human being at Rickenbacker Air National Guard Base who would open a door for him if he managed to cross 7 miles of a city that was no longer functioning. And I didn't know. I had no way of knowing. I was 9 floors up, in a locked room, wired into a system designed to connect people to resources. And the resources had dissolved, and I was the last moving part in a machine that no longer had an output. "I don't know," I said. "I'm being honest with you, Arthur. I don't know if anyone is there." The line was quiet. Then Arthur said, "Well, you're there." "I'm here." "Then someone's still working. That counts for something." He hung up, not in anger, in the tone of a man who had gotten the one thing the call could actually provide, proof that the system still had a voice, even if it no longer had hands. The queue dropped to 141, to 98, to 63. Each number a subtraction I couldn't look at directly. I took the next call, and the next. And each one was a room and a voice, and a door that was holding or not holding. And I stayed on the line or I didn't. And I said help was coming or I didn't say that. And the morning got brighter through the sealed windows, and the city below got quieter, and the tapping in the stairwell got closer. And I answered the phone. At 9:14 a.m., Keith fell asleep. He didn't announce it. He didn't fight it. He was sitting in his chair, headset off, monitoring the radio, and his head dipped forward the way heads do in the 15th hour of a shift. The involuntary, muscular surrender that no amount of coffee or willpower can permanently override. His chin touched his chest, and his breathing changed, and he was asleep. I was across the room. I saw it happen. And what I felt was not concern for Keith, but something much worse. A terror so pure and so complete that it locked every joint in my body and turned my vision white at the edges. Because I'd been awake for 23 hours, and I'd been listening all night to what happened to people who fell asleep. I didn't know yet. I need to be clear about that. I did not know, at 9:14 a.m., whether sleep was the mechanism. The calls had described people who went to sleep normally and woke up changed, but correlation is not causation. I had typed that in enough incident notes to know the difference. It was possible the infection was airborne, waterborne, contact-based, or already inside everyone. It was possible that sleep was coincidental, that the first wave simply happened at night because most of the city was already in bed. But the body doesn't process probabilities. The body heard 200 calls in which someone went to sleep and woke up trying to kill their family. And the body made its own conclusion. And the conclusion was, do not close your eyes. I watched Keith sleep. I watched his breathing. I watched for any change. In the rhythm, in the depth, in the small, unconscious movements of his hands. 12 minutes passed. His fingers twitched. I flinched so hard, I knocked my coffee off the desk. Keith opened his eyes. He blinked. He looked at me with the disoriented, slightly embarrassed expression of a man who had dozed off at work. How long? He said. 12 minutes. He rubbed his face. He was Keith. He was still Keith. The same tight jaw, the same watchful eyes. The same way of holding his shoulders slightly forward, as if bracing against a wind no one else could feel. Anything change? No. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both knew what had just been tested and what the result was. And neither of us said it because saying it would have made it real in a way that would have required us to make decisions we were not ready to make. The queue was at 29. 29 calls, holding, waiting for a voice. I took the next one. A woman named Priya, calling from a university building's Scott Lab on the Ohio State campus. She was a graduate student in mechanical engineering. She had 14 people with her in a second-floor lab, and they had barricaded the doors with desks and equipment. And they had water from a hallway fountain and a vending machine they'd broken open. They were organized. They were calm. She was calling not because she needed to be saved, but because she needed to tell someone they existed. We've been listening to the radio, Priya said. No one's coming, are they? I haven't been able to confirm the status of the staging points, I said. That's a no. Priya, I want to be straight with you. I don't have units. I don't have contact with any responding agency. I'm in the dispatch center and I'm answering phones. Just you? Me and one other. 2 of us. Out of how many? The full shift is 42. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that reordered the geometry of my entire night. Can you still broadcast on the radio? Yes. Then you're not a dispatch center anymore. You're a relay. You're the only open frequency in the city. If you broadcast what you're hearing, where the clusters are, where the roads are open, where people are, you're a map. You're the only map anyone has. I had been trained to receive calls and dispatch resources. I had been doing that, the receiving part, for 7 hours, absorbing information from every zip code in the city, building an involuntary picture of where the infected were concentrated, where pockets of survivors were holding, which routes were passable and which were not. I had that picture in my head. It was detailed, it was current, and it was locked inside a room that no one outside could access. Priya was telling me to turn the picture inside out. I can do that, I said. I can broadcast on the state emergency channel. How far does it reach? County-wide, maybe farther if the repeaters are still up. Then do it, right now. Tell people where to go and where not to go. That's what you can do. That's what only you can do. I looked at Keith. He was already moving toward the master radio panel. The first broadcast went out at 9:41 a.m. on the state emergency channel. Frequency 155.475 megahertz. I had no script. I had no protocol for this. There was no chapter in the dispatch manual titled, What to Say When You Are the Last Functioning Node in a Metropolitan Emergency System. I sat at the radio console with a legal pad on which I had spent 15 minutes writing everything I knew, organized by grid section, and I pressed the transmit key, and I talked. This is Columbus 911 Dispatch, Consolidated Emergency Communications Center, broadcasting on state emergency frequency. My name is Aaron Calloway. I am a dispatcher. I am in the municipal building on Vine Street, 9th floor. I'm going to tell you what I know about the current status of the city. The east side from Bexley to Whitehall is heavily concentrated. Champion Avenue, Livingston Avenue, Main Street east of 18th are not passable. If you are east of 270, do not attempt to move west through the city center. The north side from Clintonville through Worthington is partially clear as of 6 a.m. reporting. Route 23 north may be passable. I am not able to confirm this in real time. The west side has the highest density of calls. West Broad from the hilltop to the outer belt is impassable. Sullivan Avenue is impassable. I have received no calls from the west side in the last 40 minutes, which may indicate that everyone on the west side who could call had already called, or stopped being able to call. Which may indicate that conditions have changed beyond my ability to monitor. If you are in a secure location with supplies, I recommend you stay. If you must move, move north. Avoid I-70 in both directions. Avoid I-71 south. I will continue broadcasting updates as I receive them. If you can hear this and you have information about conditions in your area, please call 911. The lines are open. I am answering. I released the transmit key. The silence that followed felt like the silence. After a stone goes into a well, that pause, where you wait for the sound of water to tell you the well isn't dry. Keith was watching me from his chair. That was good, he said. Simple. No elaboration. Keith didn't elaborate. The calls came. Not the flood of the early morning. That wave was past, its energy spent. But a new kind of call. People who had heard the broadcast and were calling not in panic, but in purpose. A man on Hudson Street who could see I-71 from his roof and reported that the northbound lanes were blocked at the 670 split, but the southbound lanes were empty. A woman in a church on Parsons who had 23 people in the basement and a clear view of the intersection at Phrabus and said nothing had moved through it in 2 hours. A firefighter, off duty in his home in Grove City, separated from his station, who said he'd been monitoring traffic, and that Route 62 West was clear to the county line. Each call was a piece. I wrote them on the legal pad. I reorganized the picture. At 10:15, I broadcast again, adding the new information. At 10:50, again. Each broadcast was a revision, the map growing more precise with each voice that added its line. The cue counter read 7. 7 calls waiting. 7 people in a city of 900,000. I answered them all. At 11:30 a.m., someone answered back on the radio. Not a phone call. A radio transmission on the same state frequency I'd been broadcasting on. A voice. Male, young, stressed but controlled. Cutting through the static. Columbus Dispatch, this is Sergeant Torres, Ohio National Guard, Task Force Buckeye. We are hearing your broadcast. Please confirm you are live and not recorded. I grabbed the transmit key so fast I nearly pulled the console off the desk. Sergeant Torres, this is Aaron Calloway, Columbus 911. I am live. I am at the Consolidated Emergency Communications Center on Vine Street, 9th floor. There are 2 of us. Copy, Calloway. We are staging at Rickenbacker. We have a forward element moving into the city on Route 33 from the southeast. Your broadcasts have been our primary source of navigational intelligence for the last 2 hours. You are the only voice we are hearing out of Columbus. I pressed my palm against the desk. The surface was cool and solid, and I needed to feel something that wasn't the inside of my own chest. "Sergeant, what is your capacity?" "We have approximately 300 personnel with vehicles and medical. We are attempting to establish a corridor to the university campus and the downtown core. Your information about the West Side concentration has allowed us to route around Broad Street. You probably saved us a significant engagement." Keith was standing behind me now. I could feel his presence the way you feel someone in a room without turning around. A change in the air pressure. A warmth. "Sergeant, I have survivor locations. I have been logging them for 3 hours. I have addresses, head counts, supply status, and condition of access routes." "Send them all," I read from the legal pad. "Every church basement, every barricaded apartment, every university lab, every gas station and daycare center and nursing home from which a voice had called in." I read names where I had them. I read street conditions. I read the quiet zones, the areas from which no one had called at all, which were their own kind of information, the topography of absence. Torres copied each one. I could hear someone in the background repeating what I said, a second person writing it down, the information propagating outward from my voice into a system that had arms and legs and vehicles, a system that could actually reach the rooms I'd been listening to all morning. "Calloway," Torres said when I finished. "How long have you been on shift?" "Since 10 p.m. last night." "That's over 13 hours?" 14, I'm aware. "Is there anyone who can relieve you?" I looked at Keith. Keith looked at me. There was no one else. The building below us was silent, except for the tapping, which had migrated upward. I could hear it now on what sounded like the 7th floor, the 6th, a slow vertical migration that I tracked the way you track a storm on radar, watching it close the distance. "Negative," I said. "There's no relief." "Copy." A pause. "Calloway, we're going to need you to keep broadcasting. You are the only real-time picture we have. Can you do that?" Could I? The question was simple, and the answer was simple. And the thing between the question and the answer was a gap I couldn't see the bottom of. My hands were shaking. My eyes burned with a dryness that went past fatigue into something physiological. The body's last chemical plea for shutdown. The coffee was gone. The vending machine water was warm. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that had become indistinguishable from the sound of my own nervous system. "Yes," I said. "I can do that." The next 4 hours were the clearest and the worst of my life. Clear because I had purpose. I was no longer a dispatcher. I was an antenna. Every call that came in was a data point. Every broadcast that went out was a navigational correction for Torres and his 300 soldiers working their way into a city that was no longer a city, but a terrain problem. A map of moving threats and stationary survivors. And I was the only person with a view of the whole board. Worst, because the calls were changing again. The morning's calls had been about locks and doors and immediate danger. The afternoon's calls were about time. A man in a sealed restaurant walk-in cooler whose air was running out. A woman in a car on the highway with 2 children who had been sitting in the vehicle for 9 hours and the gas was empty, and the infected were standing in a ring around the parking lot, not approaching, just standing. And the children needed water. A teenage boy in an attic above a house he could hear moving beneath him. The joists creaking with a weight that circulated from room to room without stopping. These calls required a different language. The morning had been triage. Stay, move, hold. The afternoon was something else. The afternoon was accompaniment. I could not send anyone to these people. Torres was hours away from reaching most of these locations. I could only be a voice in their ear, while the math of oxygen or water or structural integrity ran out around them. I talked to a man named Dennis for 45 minutes, while he sat in a sealed office on the 14th floor of a building on High Street and watched the city through tinted glass. He described what he saw with the careful, itemized precision of someone who understood that he was providing intelligence, that his eyes were a resource. Group of approximately 20 moving south on High at Goodale. Speed is walking pace, no deviation. They are passing open doors without entering. Repeat, they are passing open doors without entering. This was new information. This mattered. The infected were not indiscriminately entering every structure. They were moving with some kind of selectivity. And the implication was that sealed, quiet buildings might be less attractive than open, active ones. I broadcast this immediately. Torres confirmed. His teams adjusted. Dennis kept reporting for another 20 minutes. Then his voice changed. Not the content, the texture. A looseness in the consonants, a drift in the sentence structure, as if the signal was degrading from the inside. "Dennis," I said, "how are you feeling?" "Tired," he said. "I've been up since yesterday morning. Long meeting yesterday. Didn't sleep well the night before." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Dennis, I need you to stay awake." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I know. I've been hearing your other calls. I know what happens." A pause. "I can feel it, though. It's not like regular tired. It's like something pulling, like gravity, but inward. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if it was a symptom or just the poetry of exhaustion, the brain reaching for metaphor when the body was shutting down. But I held the transmission key, and I talked to him about nothing, about anything, about the view from his window, about the brand of coffee in his office kitchen, about whether the Buckeyes would be any good next season. And I kept him talking for another 30 minutes until Torres confirmed a unit was entering the building from the south stairwell. "They're here," Dennis said. "I can hear them. American voices. They're here." The call ended. I crossed Dennis's location off the legal pad and moved to the next one. Keith was asleep again. This time, he had folded his arms on the desk and put his head down intentionally, giving in rather than being taken. I watched him for the required minutes. He slept. He breathed. He did not change. And I sat there at my console, 27 hours awake, and I did not sleep, not because I was afraid, though I was afraid, but because the phone was ringing, and someone was on the other end, and no one else was going to answer it. At 3:47 p.m., the tapping reached the 9th floor. It had been climbing all day. A sound I'd categorized and filed and set aside, the way dispatchers are trained to manage ambient noise, relegating it to the background so it didn't interfere with the primary signal. But there is a limit to background processing, and the limit is proximity. When the sound migrated from below and behind to directly beyond the operations room wall, it stopped being background and became the only thing in the room. Keith was awake. He'd slept for 40 minutes and risen on his own, and in the brief silence between my broadcasts, he heard it too. We both turned toward the door. The heavy, steel-cord door with the electromagnetic lock and the deadbolt. The door I had passed through 1,000 times without thinking about it. The tapping was not random. I need to be precise about this, because precision is the only thing I have left. And I will not give it up for the sake of a better story. The tapping followed a pattern: 3 strikes, a pause, 2 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes. It was not Morse code. It was not any signal pattern I recognized. But it was structured, and structure implied something that my training told me to categorize as cognitive activity. And cognitive activity in the thing on the other side of that door was a piece of information that changed the math of everything. "How many do you think?" Keith said. He was standing now, his body positioned between me and the door in a way that seemed automatic. Not heroic, not calculated. Just the posture of a man who had once been trained to stand between things. "I can't tell. One? More than one?" The tapping stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something worse. The magnetic lock on the door cycling. A faint buzz click, the sound it made when a valid keycard was presented. Then another buzz click. Then another. Something was pressing cards against the reader, not randomly, not flailing, but repeatedly, methodically, testing. I looked at Keith. He looked at the door. I thought about Stotts, who had gone to the bathroom at 5:15 a.m. and had not come back. I thought about Rita, who had gone to find him. I thought about the key cards clipped to their belts. "They have cards," I said. "Those cards work on the outer doors, not on this one. This lock requires the code. Keith, if they're testing cards, they're problem-solving." The cycling stopped. The tapping did not resume. The silence on the other side of the door had a quality I can only describe as attentive, not empty, but occupied. The silence of something that was listening as carefully as we were. I went back to the radio. I keyed up Torres. "Sergeant, this is Calloway. I have infected on my floor. They are attempting entry to the operations room. They have key cards from building personnel. They are testing them on the door reader. Entry requires a keypad code they do not appear to have." "Copy, Calloway. Can you hold?" "The door is rated for active shooter protocol. It'll hold." "How long?" I didn't know. The door was designed to resist a person with a weapon for 30 to 60 minutes. Long enough for a police response. It was not designed for sustained, patient testing by something that did not get frustrated and did not leave. "I don't know. Sergeant, what's your ETA to downtown?" "We have elements on campus now. We're 6 blocks from your building, but the route is dense. We're clearing as we go. Estimate 2 hours. 2 hours. I looked at the door. I looked at the legal pad full of survivor locations. I looked at Keith, who was standing very still, his eyes fixed on the lock panel, waiting for the next sound. "Copy," I said. 2 hours, we'll be here." I kept broadcasting. I want you to understand what that means, physically. It means sitting in a chair with a headset on, pressing a transmit key, and speaking in a measured, organized voice while something works at the door behind you. It means reading grid coordinates off a legal pad while your hands shake badly enough to blur the handwriting. It means answering a phone call from a woman trapped in a laundromat on Sullivan Avenue and telling her which direction to run, while something on the other side of 12 inches of steel and composite learns, increment by increment, how doors work. The calls were down to a handful per hour now, but each one carried weight that the early calls, back when the board was full and the night was young and the emergency was still something that might be managed, had not. Each caller who reached me in the afternoon had survived the entire day. They had outlasted the first wave, the second wave, the long, hot hours of silence. They were the remainders, the irreducibles, the people who were still holding phones and still asking for help after 12 hours of receiving none. A man named Carl, calling from the basement of a barber shop on Cleveland Avenue. He had a razor and a chair jammed under the door handle, and he had been sitting in the dark since 4 a.m. He didn't ask for rescue. He asked me to write down his daughter's name. "Sonia Elise Mitchell," he said. "She lives in Atlanta. If you make it out, tell her I was thinking about her the entire time." Tell her I sat in Dale's chair, and I thought about her. I wrote it down. I wrote every name, every message, every tell my mother, and tell my wife, and tell them I tried. The legal pad that had started as a tactical document, grid coordinates, route conditions, survivor counts, became something else in the afternoon. It became a ledger of last things. Notes passed through a wall from people I couldn't reach to people I might never find. Keith took over the radio at 4:30. His voice was rougher than mine, less modulated, but it carried the steady cadence of a man who had spent 20 years in uniform before he ever touched a dispatch console. And the soldiers on the other end responded to it instinctively. He read the updates. He relayed the survivor positions. He kept the channel alive. I answered the phones. The queue was in single digits. 5, 3, 2, 7, 4. Each call lasted longer now. Each caller needed more of me. Not information, not instructions, not the mechanical output of a dispatch system. They needed a witness. They needed someone who knew they were there, who had heard their name and written it down, who could confirm that they had existed in a room at a specific time and had spoken. I understood, in the long, bright afternoon of that impossible day, what my job had always been underneath the training and the protocols and the 10 codes and the procedures. My job was to hear people. That was the whole thing, not to save them. That was the responders' job, and the responders were gone, not to fix the problem. That was the system's job, and the system had collapsed. My job was to pick up the phone and say, I hear you. You are not alone. Your name is in my handwriting on a piece of paper, and if I make it out of this room, it will make it out with me. At 5:15 p.m., the keypad on the door beeped. Not the card reader. The keypad. A 4-digit entry attempt. Incorrect. The lock flashed red and held, but the beep meant that the thing outside, or the things outside, had moved from testing cards to testing codes. The keypad had 10 digits, and the code was 6 numbers long, which meant a million possible combinations. But the beep meant that the testing had begun. And 1 million is a large number until you divide it by patience that has no limit and time that has no cost. Keith heard it. I heard it. We looked at each other across the room. How fast can they try? Keith asked. The system locks out for 30 seconds after 3 failed attempts. Keith did the math faster than I did. At that rate, worst case, they crack it in. Years, centuries. It's not possible by brute force, unless they're not guessing randomly. I thought about the cards. I thought about Stotts, who set his keypad code to his badge number because he could never remember arbitrary strings. I thought about Rita, who kept her code on a sticky note inside her phone case because she only entered the room a few times per shift. The keypad beeped again. Incorrect. Red flash, 30-second lockout. Again, incorrect. Again, incorrect. The intervals were precise, exactly 30 seconds. Whatever was out there was counting. At 6 p.m., the generator failed. The lights didn't go out. The building was still on grid power, or whatever remained of it. But the backup systems did. The UPS batteries kicked in for the server room, giving us maybe an hour of computing power. The dispatch software flickered, caught, held. The radio, mercifully, was independent. Battery-powered portables that didn't care about the building's infrastructure. What we lost was the phone system. The 911 lines ran through a server that ran on generator backup during grid instability. And without the generator, the server began its shutdown sequence. A 45-second process I watched on my monitor with the same helpless specificity with which I had watched everything else that day. Call routing, offline. Queue management, offline. Automatic location identification, offline. The screen went dark, and the phone on my desk went silent. And the last connection between the operations room and the people still calling went dead. The silence was absolute. I had been surrounded by noise for 20 hours. Ringing lines, radio traffic, the hum of 40 monitors, the rush of climate-controlled air, the tapping, the beeping. Now it was gone. All of it. The room was as quiet as a room can be on the 9th floor of a concrete building, which is a specific kind of quiet that has texture and weight. The quiet of a space designed to be full of sound and suddenly emptied of it. I sat at my dark console and I pressed the answer key on my headset out of reflex, the way a surgeon's hand reaches for an instrument that isn't on the tray, and there was nothing there. Keith was on the portable radio. "Torres, this is Callaway Station. We've lost our phone system. We are on portable radio only. I say again, we are on portable radio only. We can still receive and broadcast on this frequency, but we cannot receive civilian calls. The 911 system is down," Torres acknowledged. His voice was closer now, not in signal strength, but in the ambient sound behind it. I could hear vehicles, voices, the organized noise of a military element in motion. They were in the city. They were close. "We are on 4th Street moving north," Torres said. "We will be at your building within 90 minutes. Can you hold?" The keypad beeped. "Incorrect." Red flash. "We can hold," Keith said. I stood up from my console for the first time in 4 hours. My legs ached. My back was a single compressed line of pain from my neck to my hips. I walked to the window, the same window Keith had stood at that morning, and I looked out at the city. The sun was going down. The western sky was orange and pink above the skyline, and the buildings threw long shadows eastward. And in those shadows, I could see movement. Not the frantic, individual movement of the morning, when people were running and cars were swerving and the city was a body in seizure. This movement was slow, collective. Rivers of figures flowing through the streets in loose columns, silent, unhurried, moving west toward the sunset like something drawn by the light. They were beautiful. I hated that I thought that. And I need to say it because this is a record, and a record that leaves things out is not a record. They were beautiful the way a murmuration of starlings is beautiful. Hundreds of bodies moving in unconscious coordination, flowing around obstacles, merging and splitting and reforming. A system that had no command structure and no language and no plan, but moved with a coherence that looked, from the 9th floor, like intention. I turned away from the window. I sat back down at my dead console. I picked up the portable radio. "Torres," I said. "Callaway. Be advised. Large groups moving west through the downtown grid. Hundreds, maybe more. They are not entering buildings at this time. They are moving in the open on the main corridors. If you approach from the east, you will intersect them." "Copy, Callaway. Can you give me a count on 4th Street?" I went back to the window. I looked down. 9th floor. Close enough to see shapes, far enough to count movement. 4th Street was clear for 2 blocks, then dense for 3, then clear again. 4th is blocked between Town and Rich. Clear north of Town. Recommend you approach on 3rd or front. Adjusting route. Thank you, Callaway. I stayed at the window. I guided Torres's convoy through the streets below me like a voice directing a ship through a harbor from a lighthouse. Unable to move, unable to reach, but able to see. And in this new configuration of the world, seeing was enough. At 7:38 p.m., the keypad on the door accepted a code. The sound was small. A beep, a green flash, the click of the electromagnetic bolt releasing. No different from the sound it made every day when any of the 42 dispatchers on staff entered the room at the start of a shift. A small, administrative sound. The sound of access granted. Keith moved first. He was closer to the door, and he put his body against it, shoulder and hip, driving his weight into the steel. The door pushed inward. The force on the other side was steady, mechanical, without urgency. The way water pushes against a dam, not in violence, but in physics. "Aaron," Keith said, "I can't hold this." I was already there. I put my weight next to his. The door was open an inch, maybe 2. Through the gap I could see the hallway. Fluorescent lights still on. Gray carpet. And in that thin vertical slice of visible space, a hand. A human hand. Fingers extended, pressing flat against the door's surface. It was wearing a wristwatch. It was Stotz's wristwatch. The chunky silver Citizen he'd gotten for his 20th anniversary and never stopped talking about. I pushed harder. Keith pushed harder. The door closed. I reached for the deadbolt. The manual one. The one that didn't depend on power or codes. And threw it. The bolt sank into the frame with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The pushing continued. The deadbolt held. The door vibrated against its frame with a low, continuous hum, like a tuning fork struck and held. Keith stepped back. He was breathing hard. I was breathing hard. We stood in the middle of the operations room and looked at the door and listened to the sound of people we had known pressing against it with the patience of a geological process. "That was his code," Keith said. "Stotz, badge number." "I know." They remembered his code. "I know, Keith." We were silent. The pushing continued. The deadbolt held, but it was a mechanical device, a steel rod in a steel channel, and mechanical devices have tolerances and fatigue limits. And I did not know what those limits were because I'd never had reason to think about them before. I picked up the radio. "Torres, Calloway. They breached the primary lock on the operations room. We are on the manual deadbolt." "How long?" "Calloway, we are on Vine Street. We are entering the building now. We are coming up the stairs." "Hold on. Vine Street. That was here. That was our building." I could hear it in his transmission. The echo of a stairwell, boots on concrete, the contained acoustics of an interior vertical space. They were below us, climbing. Keith went to the window that faced the street. "I can see vehicles," he said. "Humvees, they're here." The pushing on the door increased, not in force, but in distribution. I could hear multiple points of pressure now, multiple hands, the door flexing microscopically at different locations along its surface. The deadbolt held, but the door wasn't a wall. It was a door. It was designed to open. I sat down at my dead console. I put on my headset. The headset was connected to nothing. No system, no phone line, no caller. But I put it on because it was mine, and because for 21 hours it had been the instrument through which I had done the only thing I knew how to do. And if this was the last room I was going to sit in, I was going to sit in it as the person I had been all day. The deadbolt shifted. A millimeter. I saw the rod flex in its channel. From below, rising through the floor, the sound of gunfire. Not close. Several floors down. Then boots, faster, the rhythm of people running upward through a stairwell with purpose. The deadbolt shifted again. Keith picked up a fire extinguisher from the wall bracket by the kitchen. He held it by the base, like a club. He looked at me with an expression that was not fear and not courage, but something between to the face of a man who had decided what the next 30 seconds were going to look like and was simply waiting for them to start. The deadbolt broke free. The door opened. What came through was not a wave. It was 3 bodies, moving in the coordinated, unhurried way I had watched from the window all afternoon. They entered the room, and they moved toward us. And they did not run. And they did not make a sound. And the overhead lights reflected off their open eyes. The first was Stotts. His badge was still clipped to his belt. His headset hung around his neck. He moved with the same deliberate precision he had used at his console. Stotts the careful, Stotts the methodical, his body carrying the ghost of the man's habits even after the man himself was gone. The second was Rita. She was still wearing her reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead the way she always wore them when she left her office. The third was someone I didn't recognize. Building security, maybe, or maintenance. Someone from a lower floor who had been climbing with them. Keith stepped forward with the extinguisher. From the stairwell door, 30 feet down the hall, American voices. 9th floor, clear left. Moving to the east wing. Go, go. Soldiers entered the hallway behind the 3 figures. The next 12 seconds were noise and motion that I will not describe because what happened in those seconds was a mechanical event. A problem being solved by people trained to solve it. And the people who had been Stotts and Rita and the unknown third person were part of the problem. And the soldiers solved it. And then it was over. A sergeant appeared in the doorway of the operations room. Not Torres. A younger man, sweating, weapon up, scanning the room with trained eyes that checked every corner and surface before settling on us. 2 civilians, he said into his radio. Dispatch personnel. 9th floor ops room. They're good. Sergeant Torres came upstairs 20 minutes later. He was shorter than his voice. Compact, dark-eyed, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake as long as I had, but had spent those hours outside rather than in. He looked at the operations room. He looked at the dead consoles, the dark screens, the empty chairs. He looked at Keith's fire extinguisher on the floor where Keith had dropped it. He looked at the legal pad on my desk. Is that the survivor list? He said. Yes. He picked it up. He flipped through the pages. 3 of them, front and back, dense with my handwriting. Grid coordinates, addresses, names, head counts, route conditions, last contact times. And the other entries. The personal ones. The messages and names and last words dictated to me by people who understood that a voice on a phone was the only record they were going to leave. This is the most complete picture of the city we have, Torres said. More complete than satellite. More complete than our own reconnaissance. You built this from phone calls? From phone calls. He looked at me. I was sitting in my chair. I had not stood up when the soldiers entered. I had not stood up when Torres came in. My legs were not working in the way that legs work when you tell them to, because the adrenaline that had been running my body like a substitute circulatory system for the past 4 hours had stopped pumping the moment the soldiers appeared. And what was left underneath was a person who had been awake for 22 hours and seated for most of them and had nothing left in the tank. We need to get you out of the building, Torres said. We've got a medical station at the staging area. I know, Rickenbacker. You've been sending people there all day. I've been sending people everywhere. I don't know how many arrived. Torres looked at the legal pad again. He held it carefully, the way you hold a document that isn't yours. We'll find out, he said. We'll cross-reference. Keith was already on his feet. Keith was always on his feet. He had slept twice in 22 hours, and each time had risen as if a switch had been flipped. The old army wiring still lived under the civilian surface. He put on his jacket. He looked at me. Can you walk? He said. Give me a minute. I sat in my chair. The operations room was quiet. The consoles were dark. The master board on the wall, which had spent the day cycling through green, yellow, and red, was black, unpowered, its indicators meaningless. The phone on my desk was silent. The headset on my head was connected to nothing. I took the headset off. I set it on the desk beside the keyboard, positioning the microphone parallel to the edge the way Janae had done that morning before she walked out. I don't know why I did that. It was not a conscious choice. It was the body performing a ritual that the mind hadn't authorized. The hands doing the small, precise work of closing a station because the hands knew that the station was closed, even if the person attached to them hadn't fully absorbed it yet. Then I stood up. My legs held. They shook, but they held. I picked up the legal pad. I folded it and put it inside my jacket, against my chest, where I could feel the edges of the paper through the fabric. 47 names, 12 personal messages, 6 complete addresses for next of kin, the entire tactical history of a city's collapse and the human residue caught in the filter. I walked out of the operations room. I walked past the place in the hallway where Stotts and Rita had been. And I did not look down. And I walked to the stairwell. And I went down 9 flights of stairs with a soldier in front of me and a soldier behind me and Keith beside me. And I walked out of the building into the evening air of a city I had listened to die for an entire day without ever leaving my chair. They flew us to Rickenbacker that night. A helicopter. My first time in one. The city passed below in the dark, block by block, streetlight by streetlight, the grid I had memorized through voices now visible as geography. I looked down and I matched what I saw to what I had heard. There was Champion Avenue, where Arthur filled his bathtub. There was the campus, where Priya organized 14 engineers into a relay station. There was the barber shop on Cleveland, where Carl sat in Dale's chair and said his daughter's name. I found Sonia Mitchell 3 weeks later. Atlanta, like Carl said. I read her his message from the legal pad, and she sat very still. And then she said, "He always sat in that chair. Even when Dale was alive, it was always that chair. I don't dispatch anymore. The system is being rebuilt, but I won't be in the room when it goes live." 22 hours was enough. 22 hours was a career and a lifetime and a record that I carry in a folded legal pad in a drawer beside my bed. And some nights I open it and read the names, and some nights I don't. And both kinds of nights are hard. The last entry on the pad is not a name or an address. It's a sentence I wrote during the final minutes before the soldiers came through the door, when the deadbolt was giving, and Keith had the extinguisher, and I was sitting at a dead console with a headset plugged into nothing. I wrote it because I'd been writing all day, and writing was the thing I could still do. It says, "Still answering." I don't know who I wrote it for. I don't know if it was a record or a prayer or just the hand refusing to stop when the system already had. But it's there, in my handwriting, on the last line. And if anyone ever needs to know what the 911 operator was doing when the city went dark, the answer is on the pad. She was still answering.